Thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I hope I will only take up my allocated time. And just to say that I'm responsible mainly for climate change in the Africa region, and North Africa and Southern Africa region. But what I'm going to do is frame it a little bit more globally, but a lot of my examples are obviously going to come from Africa. So I think just to start off by saying that when we think about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, I think we tend to think of the big emitters like energy, which is guzzling up coal in generating electricity, transport, where cars are producing greenhouse gas emissions. But in fact, cities in their own right are also major contributors to global warming. Cities produce about 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with buildings alone responsible for about 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions that cause global warming. And that from buildings, that comes from the building operations, and it comes from the materials that are used in the building. So if you think of cities with, kilometer after kilometer of concrete, tar, pipes, all of that embodies a lot of carbon, and in turn captures a lot of heat and creates quite a little hothouse in the cities. In addition, cities are getting bigger, urban areas are getting bigger, so that by 2050, it's estimated that about 68% of people are going to be living in cities. So that's cities are just getting huge, and they're getting sprawling, and a lot of them are not particularly well designed. They start, the amount of informal housing, etc. So as well as contributing to climate change, cities, and particularly the poor and vulnerable communities in cities, also suffer hugely from the consequences of climate change. And some of the most vulnerable are actually migrants, internally displaced people, many of whom have been forced off the land because the land can no longer sustain them because of climate change. So because of climate change, they come to the city, and there they're confronted with a very precarious living and a very precarious life, as climate change also impacts on the city, and they have very few resources to draw on. So cities suffer also the consequences of, the extreme weather that we associate with climate change, floods, droughts, fires. We've seen some of the drastic fires that have happened around the globe in cities, affecting cities hugely. Cities also suffer from a lack of water when water resources are compromised, when there are droughts. Health workers at a local government level have to deal with a higher burden of disease, with the spread of diseases that they haven't had to confront before, malaria in areas where there's never been malaria, the intensification of diseases, and heat stress as a cause of disease and potential death is also becoming a bigger issue that we're needing to confront. So heat stress can cause heart attacks, strokes, chronic kidney disease. So basically what I'm trying to say is that every single kind of problem that cities and urban areas have in delivering an equitable service is going to be made much, much worse by climate change and by the impact of climate change. So cities have to mitigate, so they have to find ways of reducing their carbon emissions, and they have to adapt. They have to put in place measures that help the cities and people living in those cities and working in those cities to survive and to manage the consequences of climate change. So I think it's very important point to make is that we need a solid base of quality public services, because that immediately makes communities and cities far more resilient and a little bit less vulnerable. And that without building strong public quality services, the impact of climate change is so much worse. All public sector workers in cities, in urban areas, feel the impact of climate change and have to deal with the consequences of climate change. But obviously it is emergency responders who are the most affected. They must deal with the cyclones, the fires, the droughts, etc. And if I can talk about an example here in Africa, in Mozambique, in March 2019, Mozambique was hit by a massive Cyclone Ida, which devastated the city, flooded huge amounts of land, displaced thousands of people. And it wasn't only the immediate issue of emergency responders having to deal with people injured, people having to be rescued, people displaced. Even when the weather subsided, what had happened was that water infrastructure had been destroyed, electricity infrastructure had been destroyed, people's homes had been destroyed. So all those services that local government is responsible for and needs to deal with were destroyed, in a very bad state, and the public sector workers have to come in and try and deal with that. And I think that's sort of part of why I'm arguing that without a strong base of public services, it makes dealing with climate change that much more complicated. So that we're not only talking about the extreme conditions of extreme weather and the reality of dealing with that, but we're also talking about the day-to-day wearing down of vulnerable communities by the way climate change worsens their situation. So if I look at some of the services very quickly, and I could spend a long time on each service, but I won't. Daria mentioned waste. So for instance, waste is a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. When waste is not properly managed, when landfill sites are not properly managed, when organic waste decomposes, it releases a lot of methane into the atmosphere, which is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. When then a major cyclone comes along, as it did in Mozambique, when you've got a situation when the waste hasn't been properly managed, the cyclone comes and devastates and destroys what infrastructure there was, and waste is kind of, completely spread everywhere. It's very badly dealt with. There's considerably more waste from all the destruction. So waste becomes a major area where local government workers have to concentrate. Other areas where cities have to focus is on if we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, on regulating buildings, on how they built, with what they built, how they constructed, making sure that building regulations are in place and properly enforced. Energy efficiency is a major issue for climate change. So making sure that buildings, when they're built, are energy efficient, that they are reducing the amount of energy that they're using. And that's not just about for new build, that is also about for retrofitting existing buildings. So retrofitting buildings in a place like South Africa, where I come from, is a major issue. It should be a major issue because so many buildings have been built without taking into account climate change issues. Now, all these areas, creating green areas in a city as a way of trying to release some of the trapped heat, putting in place cooling centers where people, when heat stress becomes a major issue, people can go to cool down. All of these areas are actually ways in which reasons, in fact, to increase the amount of public sector workers at local government. So they're all ways that highlight the importance of jobs and more jobs at a city or a municipal level in order to deal with the consequences of climate change. But I think one of the big problems that cities and urban areas face is the finance to do that. And we've seen at COP the big fights around climate finance. So first of all, just to say that cities often struggle just to get enough finance from the national fiscus in many countries to deliver a basic level of quality public services. When you add climate, the crisis of climate onto that, there's just not, finance is a major issue. And what we saw at COP was the complete lack of commitment to make financing available for countries where adaptation is necessary. And in fact, what happens is that when that financing is made available, it's often in a way which either puts the country more into debt or forces the country or the city to actually privatize services. So you'll often read about how cities are sometimes at the leading edge of dealing with climate crisis and taking initiatives that national governments are not taking. But that's often through privatizing the services and commercializing the services. When climate finance is provided through loans, as I said, that increases the debt. And in fact, it's estimated in Africa that not only in Africa, lower income countries are spending 5 times more on debt, on paying their debt, than on coping with mitigation and adaptation in relation to climate change. So that just is an indication of how big a problem the issue of finance for climate change is. I also just think it's important to note that as much as emergency responders are absolutely crucial in dealing with climate change, many countries' adaptation plans don't actually kind of take them into consideration, don't actually look at emergency responders and how to strengthen them, etc., etc. So that's a huge gap, and I think it's something we do need to look at. I think just then, I don't know how much time I've been taking up, but I think just then to finish off by looking at what role then can local government public sector workers play in terms of dealing with climate change, with meeting all those challenges that I've tried to outline of the way that climate change makes delivering a quality public service so much more difficult. And obviously one of those ways is to try and influence and lobby government. But we know that that's not easy in many countries because governments don't like trade unions and workers to get involved in those broader socioeconomic issues. They want to keep them dealing only with kind of bread and butter workplace issues. So certainly that is an issue in a lot of countries in Africa. But I think one of the areas that we really need to focus on and look at in the same way that we have with other services is that workers in these services, waste, water, electricity, health, are the ones that are most intimately concerned with the service and understand the service the best. So I think it is to those workers that we need to look for ideas and suggestions about how greenhouse gas emissions in those services can be reduced in ways that are not detrimental to workers, and how those services, public services, can best be strengthened and also adapted in order to deal with the consequences of climate change. So, the health sector, increased numbers of workers, better training to deal with more diseases and new diseases that are coming in because of climate change. Strong, a lot of focus on waste and waste management so that is reduced as an area of climate change. Making sure that buildings are properly regulated, that there are enough people around to regulate buildings, that they are not contributing, that their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions are reduced. So maybe I can leave it there, and I hope I've managed to sketch out some of the broad areas in which we need to focus when we're looking at climate change in relation to local government and municipalities. So thanks very much, Daria.